And the same thing is true with communism. Here's an interesting statement. Of course, everybody knows, I guess, by now that Karl Marx was an evolutionist. In fact, he wanted to dedicate his book on capital to Darwin. And all the communists from Marx's day on to the present day have been evolutionists. That's one of their tenets. But here's an article by a man by the name of Cliff Connor in a magazine called International Socialist Review, the monthly magazine to the supplement to The Militant. November 1980 this was written, and this was written against the creation movement. Evolution versus Creation. In Defense of Scientific Thinking was the title. And he says this: by defending Darwinism, working people strengthen their defenses against the attacks of these reactionary outfits, which he means creationists, and they prepare the way for the transformation of the social order. He says, we are revolutionary socialists whose aim is, as Marx said, not merely to interpret the world, but to change it. And of all those eminent researchers of the 19th century that have left us such a rich heritage of knowledge, we're especially grateful to Charles Darwin for opening our way to an evolutionary dialectical understanding of nature. Communism was based on evolution, and of course now we see communism failing too around the world because it also is based on a false premise. Well, now we can't take a lot of pride in that because, as a matter of fact, even in this country and in the so-called Christian West, what might be called laissez-faire capitalism, that is, capitalism operating under the idea that the strongest survive in the world of economics and corporations and businesses and so on, that also is based on evolution. Let me read a statement from Andrew Carnegie, one of the great industrialists of the 19th century, whose name is now somewhat revered. He's got a great university named after him and a great library and foundation and so on. But he said this in one of his articles. He said, the law of competition is here. We cannot evade it. No substitutes for it have been found. And while the law may sometimes be hard for individuals, it's best for the race because it ensures the survival of the fittest in every department. And he justified then his monopolistic practices and his exploitation of labor and all of these things on the basis of evolution. He says, I remember the light came in as a flood and all was clear. Not only had I got rid of theology and the supernatural, but I found the truth of evolution. And what's true of Carnegie was true of John D. Rockefeller, the oil baron, and Raymond Hill, the railroad baron, and many others whose modus operandi and whose philosophy was the survival of the fittest and the struggle for existence and Darwinian evolution. They called it in those days social Darwinism. Now that has kind of a bad name among many people today, but as a matter of fact, many of our modern capitalists are still operating on the same principle. And this leads to the subject of racism, because this is tied in with it too. Hitler was a racist, Marx was a racist, men like Rockefeller were racist. Matter of fact, Charles Darwin was a racist. Many people have the idea that racism, the idea that one race was better than another race, that came from the Southern fundamentalists or something like that, but that isn't true. It's an evolutionary idea. In fact, a race is basically an evolutionary term. It's a subspecies in the process of evolving into a new species. In fact, Darwin's book, The Origin of Species by Natural Selection, was subtitled The Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. And he was talking not just about animal races, but about human races. In fact, let me read a statement not from The Origin of Species, but from his other book, The Descent of Man. He says, at some future period, not very distant as measured by centuries, the civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace the savage races throughout the world. At the same time, the apes will no doubt be exterminated. The break between man and his nearest allies, man is very close to the ape, he says, but the break between them will then be wider because it will intervene between man and a more civilized state as the lower human races are eliminated, and as we may hope, even then the Caucasian, and some ape as low as a baboon instead of as now between the Negro or Australian and the gorilla. That's a terrible thing for a man to say. He said there was not very much of a gap between the Negro and the Australian and the gorilla, and now since both the higher apes like the gorillas are going to be eliminated and the lower races like these Negroes and Australians and so on are going to be eliminated, then the gap between man and the apes will be wider. In other words, he believed that there was an evolutionary succession and that the higher apes were very closely related to the lowest human races and so on up to the highest race, which was a Caucasian. Now, no evolutionist, I don't think, believes that today, but that's what Darwin believed. As a matter of fact, that's what Thomas Huxley believed, and all of the 19th century scientists who were leading evolutionists, almost all of them, believed in racism. And it wasn't just the 19th century. This belief prevailed in this country among evolutionary anthropologists who deal with the history of mankind up until the middle of the century, when Hitler finally gave racism a bad name. And then they stopped believing it. But here, for example, is what Henry Fairfield Osborn said. Now, Osborn, if you're not familiar with him, was probably the leading anthropologist of this country up until the mid-century point. He was the director of the American Museum of Natural History. He was the one who became famous for his discovery and promotion of the so-called Nebraska man, which turned out to be not an ape man at all like he thought, but rather an extinct pig. But he was going to introduce that evidence at the famous Scopes trial. Anyway, Osborn was a top authority among anthropologists, and look what he said. Among other things, this is in his article on the evolution of human races, published in Natural History. He said, in my opinion, the three primary stocks diverged from each other before the beginning of the Pleistocene or Ice Age. In other words, the three great races have been evolving independently of each other for about 1 million years. He says the Negroid stock is even more ancient than the Caucasian and Mongolian, as may be proved by an examination not only of the brain and the hair and the bodily characters, the teeth, the genitalia, the sense organs, and the instincts, the intelligence. He says then the standard of intelligence of the average adult Negro is similar to that of the 11-year-old youth of the species Homo sapiens. What a thing to say. For a man at this originally was published in 1926. In other words, he says that the Negro race is not even of the species Homo sapiens, but some kind of lower race, not even human. Now, understand, no evolutionist that I know of believes that today. Maybe there are a few, but not many, because they stopped believing in racism with Hitler giving it such a bad name. But that's what they did believe during all the great time of the advance of modern evolution in the thinking of anthropologists and other evolutionists. Well, you could go on and show that all the other evil philosophies that have plagued the world are based on evolutionary thinking, but the same is also true of evil practices. You saw some of those listed on the fruit as the fruit of the evolutionary tree. Practices such as abortionism, for example. Now, many Christians are very concerned about this terrible plague of abortion that has been sweeping over our country the last several years. And of course, people commit sin for all kinds of reasons. Not every young woman who has an abortion or doctor who performs one is an evolutionist, but whenever anybody tries to justify it scientifically or rationally, they do so on the basis of the fact that the fetus which is aborted is not really a human being. Well, how can they say there's not a human being? Well, they do so on the basis of evolution. You see, one of the main proofs of evolution which Charles Darwin advocated back in 1859 in his book, and as a matter of fact, which his grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, advocated in his book, even before Charles Darwin was born, is the idea of embryologic recapitulation. Now, I don't know how many people have heard of that. It used to be taught in all the biology textbooks in high schools, and I think in the general science books in junior high schools, and certainly in all the colleges, the idea that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. Now, if you're not familiar with those terms, let me read the statement of a man by the name of Eli Schneur in an article in the Los Angeles Times just last year. And Dr. Schneur says he was chairman of the Southern California Skeptics Society, but he's also director of the Biosystems Research Institute in La Jolla, California. Now, this man is discussing this point. He says, life doesn't begin, it continues. Ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. This is a fundamental tenet of modern biology that derives from evolutionary theory and is thus anathema to the creationists as well as to those who are opposed to freedom of choice. Now he defines what these two terms are. So here's what he's talking about. Ontogeny is the name for the process of development of a fertilized egg into a fully formed and mature living organism. So the development of the embryo in the womb is ontogeny. Phylogeny, on the other hand, is the history of the evolution of a species, in this case the human being, the evolutionary history. And he says during the development, this fertilized egg progresses over 38 weeks through what is in fact a rapid passage through evolutionary history. From a single primordial cell, the conceptus progresses through being something of a protozoan, then a fish, then a reptile, then a bird, a primate, ultimately a human being. And so you see this fetus in the womb, they like to call it fetus instead of a little baby. It starts out as a one-celled organism in a liquid environment like that imaginary primeval cell in the primordial soup, and it develops into a multi-celled invertebrate, and then into a vertebrate in a liquid environment still. It becomes a fish with gills and gill slits. and then it becomes an amphibian, then finally a reptile, and maybe a monkey with a tail, and eventually a human being. And so, if you destroy that